A Faculty Guide to Providing Accommodations to Students with Disabilities, presented by Gary Greco, Director of the Special Resource Center, and Janie Ishikawa, Director of Staff and Student Diversity. This is the first of 3 modules designed to provide you, as a faculty member at El Camino College, with an understanding of what your role is in providing academic accommodations to students with disabilities. This module will cover the relevant federal and state laws that require faculty to provide academic accommodations to qualified students with disabilities. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act protects qualified individuals with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of disability in services, programs, and activities protected by state and local government entities. Section 504 requires the needs of students with disabilities to be met as adequately as the needs of the non-disabled are met. Under Section 504, no otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall solely by reason of his or her disability be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity of a public entity. Section 508 requires the district to make sure electronic and information technology, such as class materials via Canvas, are accessible to people with disabilities.
State Code and Regulations. California codes and regulations largely mirror federal law. Under the California Education Code, California community colleges are required to provide equal access to programs and facilities for all students. And we are required to create disabled students programs and services, such as the Special Resource Center.
When do these laws apply to us at El Camino? The ADA, Sections 504 and 508, California Education Code, and Title V regulations apply to El Camino College and its employees with regards to any person with a disability who is qualified. When a student with a disability is qualified, we are required to provide equal access to all of our programs, facilities, and services.
Who is considered disabled? For California community colleges, persons with a disability means any person who, number 1, has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. Those include walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, and working. Number 2, has a record of such an impairment, or number 3, is regarded as having such an impairment. Examples of disabilities may include AIDS, cancer, cerebral palsy, diabetes, epilepsy, head injuries, hearing impairments, specific learning disabilities, loss of limbs, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy, psychiatric disorders, speech impairments, spinal cord injuries, and visual impairments.
When is a person with disabilities qualified? For California community colleges, a student with a disability is qualified when he or she meets the academic and technical standards requisite to admission or participation in the education, program, or activity, with or without reasonable modifications to rules, policies, or practices, the removal of architectural, communication, or transportation barriers, or the provision of auxiliary aids and services. If a disabled student meets academic and technical standards for participating in a district program or activity, either with or without reasonable accommodations, they are qualified to receive equal access to all of our programs, facilities, and services. It is the SRC's role to verify and determine whether or not a disabled student is qualified.
Academic standards. A disabled student needs to meet academic standards in order to be qualified. This means that if a disabled student is able to meet the academic standards of a class with a reasonable accommodation, they are qualified. However, if a disabled student has a reasonable accommodation and still cannot meet the academic standards of a class, they are not qualified.
Technical standards. A disabled student also needs to meet technical standards in order to be qualified. An example of a technical standard is our Student Code of Conduct. If a student violates our Student Code of Conduct, they do not meet the technical standards of the district and are therefore not qualified. At the community college level, a student may not be disciplined or excluded on the basis of their disability. However, they may be disciplined if the way in which their disabilities manifest themselves violates district policies and rules. For example, if a student has PTSD, which causes them to erupt in anger during class, it may be considered a code of conduct violation. The key is that any procedural protections, such as due process and appeal rights, or rules enforced against non-disabled students need to be applied in the same manner and to the same extent as for disabled students, and vice versa.
Remember, it is not a choice. As an El Camino faculty member, you are required to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified disabled students.
What is a reasonable accommodation? A reasonable accommodation is one that is individualized to the specific student. You cannot provide a standard accommodation. It is not a one-size-fits-all process. You should collaborate with your dean and SRC staff to assess what is an appropriate and reasonable accommodation.
It does not have to be the student's first choice. It does not have to be the best available option. It does have to provide equal access. It does not have to provide greater access.
You may not impose upon or limit participation of a qualified disabled student. You may not prohibit audio recordings in classrooms, and you may not prohibit service animals in classrooms.
You may alter the time permitted to complete degree requirements. You may substitute specific courses for completing degree requirements. You may adapt how specific courses are conducted. You may not modify academic requirements essential to the program of instruction or to any directly related licensing requirement.
Now you know that you, as a faculty member at El Camino College, are required to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified disabled students. But what happens if you fail to provide reasonable accommodations? When a qualified disabled student is excluded from participating in, denied the benefits of, or otherwise subjected to differential treatment in any of the district's programs, activities, benefits, or services, you may be liable for unlawful discrimination. When a qualified disabled student is treated negatively because of their disability in a severe and pervasive manner, where it has the effect of excluding them from our programs, activities, benefits, or services, it may be considered harassment based on disability. This is a form of unlawful discrimination which is in violation of our district policies.
Remember, as a faculty member of El Camino College, you are required to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified disabled students. To be considered disabled, a student must have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. To be considered qualified, a disabled student must meet both academic and technical standards for admission or participation in a district program or activity. It is the SRC's job to verify and determine whether or not a disabled student is qualified. Remember, as a faculty member of El Camino College, you are required to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified disabled students. To be considered disabled, a student must have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. To be considered qualified, a student must meet both academic and technical standards for admission or participation in a district program or activity. It is the SRC's job to verify and determine whether or not a disabled student is qualified.
If you have questions, concerns, or feedback, please do not hesitate to contact Gary Greco, Director of the Special Resource Center, and Janie Ishikawa, Director of Staff and Student Diversity.